So before we introduce you to the first of our speakers, I have the pleasure of warming up the crowd slightly. So together with Mona, we are going to tell you a little bit about our research. So let me just share my screen here. So I think that everybody should be interested in what Stone Age people ate for their breakfast. So my PhD is in environmental science, and this is my kind of the subject within that that I worked on, and I'm going to tell you why I think you should be interested in what Stone Age people ate. So one of the most significant changes in human history happened about 6,000 years ago. So what happened 6,000 years ago, just before 6,000 years ago, the way that we lived, the way that we fed ourselves was through hunting and gathering. So we moved around where the food was, and we took all our lives with us. We moved around in small groups, and we hunted animals, and we gathered what was available to us that was growing in the wild. So that's how we lived in the Mesolithic period. This is the Mesolithic period that I'm talking about. And then what happened about 6,000 years ago is we started farming. So you'll see here on this cave painting that you can see people are they're farming cattle here in this picture. We started to domesticate animals, we started to grow crops, and this had a profound effect on the way that humans lived. So instead of having to move about and having to essentially be dictated, have their lives dictated by the food that they wanted or needed, they were able to actually start settling in one place because they could control the food that they consumed. So that meant that we no longer needed to move about to find our food. We could build more permanent structures, so that we see the beginnings of stone buildings and being built around this time. Because people were staying in one place, communities grew and social hierarchy came out of that. So out of that came governments and the government rule. And essentially what this was the start of human society as we know it today. So everything that our human society today kind of came around because of farming. And farming was so important and so effective that it is still, to this day, how we feed the world. So it's super important, one of the most important changes in human history. However, we don't really understand it. So the way that we find out about the past is through a multitude of different, we gather evidence from a multitude of different subjects. The archaeological evidence, so the physical evidence from that time period, comes in the form of shell middens, and these are huge, massive hills made of shells, essentially, oyster shells and lots of other edible shells. And you can find these all across Scotland, all across Europe, and from that you can quite sensibly infer that we ate a lot of shellfish around 6,000 years ago while we were farming. However, when you use a very reliable, very established, very credible chemistry technique to analyze the bones of people that were the first farmers, you can't detect shellfish and marine fish consumption in their diet. And so there's this disparity between the archaeological evidence and the scientific, the analytical chemistry evidence. And it's this chemistry approach that I focused on for my PhD. So I'll explain a little bit about the technique that I used and how it works. What I used was called stable isotope analysis. And essentially, this technique is based on the principle that you are what you eat. So you are literally made up of the food that you eat, in that the molecules that you consume in your food, the carbon, the nitrogen, all of the chemical elements that you consume in the food go towards making up your body tissues. So your bone and your muscle is all made up of what you eat. So you literally are what you eat. And in terms of bone isotope analysis, you are what you ate over the last 10 years. So if you took a sample of your bone and you measured your isotopes, the isotopes would reflect your diet over the last 10 years. What this means is that when a skeleton is preserved, so when a person's body is preserved, so are the dietary signals that are contained within that skeleton. And so you can then break down that skeleton into its chemical elements. We use acids. So on the slide here, you can see pictures of, this is bone fragments in hydrochloric acid, which is the technique that the protocol that I use to prepare my samples. We break down the bone using acid and then combustion, and we can measure the individual chemical elements that come directly from the food that you ate. And I looked at stable carbon isotope analysis and stable nitrogen isotope analysis to tell us about what we ate. So the problem that I applied this technique to, oh no, sorry, there are kind of two problems that I had when I was going through my PhD. So the first one is that because the transition to farming from hunting and gathering happened, it didn't happen overnight, it happened over generations. The transition in diet was slow, and so you need to be able to see very small changes in diet to be able to understand this transition better. And with the technique that I use, that's not possible. So you can say that somebody ate a lot of meat or a lot of fish, but if you ate a small amount of meat, that probably won't show up in the diet. We also, to make this technique work, we also need examples of the food, so bone samples from the animals that were available at the time. So we need 6,000-year-old animal bone to be able to recreate 6,000-year-old diet. And in Scotland, at least, we don't have that, or we have very, very few of those samples, and you need a lot of them to be able to do this, technique correctly. So I have two problems that I need to solve before I can use isotope analysis to be able to tell us more about diet. What I did to tackle these problems, and what I aimed to do, was to refine isotope analysis so that I would be able to tell us a bit more about where we come from and how we got here. But in doing that, it would also be useful to lots of other different scientific fields that also uses stable isotope analysis. So forensic science, ecology, zoology, biology, archaeology, all of these fields uses isotope analysis. And if I could refine that, then it would be useful to all of this research as well. So what I did was I took measurements of modern food, so modern animal bone involved a lot of chopping up animals in the lab, and I compared the measurements of the isotopes against ancient samples, and they matched. So the isotope signals matched, which was good. That meant that I could take isotope measurements from modern food from the same environment as my human samples, and I measured them against my human population from 6,000 years ago to provide this dietary comparison. I then measured the isotopes of the bones of these people that lived 6,000 years ago, and using those measurements, I was able to recreate their diet. After I refined those results using a Bayesian mixing model. So from that, I was able to go from, so this individual is based in the Hunterian and is one of the examples of one of the first farmers in Scotland. Before my research, we would have been able to say that this person ate a lot their, they got a lot of the dietary protein from terrestrial sources, which meant that they ate a lot of meat. After my research, we are now able to say that this person ate about 75% of their dietary protein from terrestrial sources, and we are now able to identify not just small amounts of other sources, but we're able to tell you we are able to tell different categories of marine resources. So 20% of this person's diet came from marine fish, and they ate 5% of their diet from shellfish. So we have a much clearer picture of what this person is doing at the beginning of farming, which is, although this person is farming, he was still hunting and gathering to gather some of their food, and there was still this continuity that happens between hunting and gathering and farming. There wasn't a rejection of hunting and gathering, as some archaeologists have suggested, and the science and the archaeology now agrees. So this slightly settles the argument between the archaeology and the science, but obviously this is only applicable for Scotland, and it would be really interesting to see the technique applied in a wider geographical area. But it tells us more about how human society evolved and how we got here today. And also the technique can be applied to lots of other areas of science that use this same approach, isotope analysis, as an analytical tool. So that's why I think you should be interested in what Stone Age people had for their breakfast. So in contrast to my very kind of chemistry approach, I'm going to introduce Mona, who has a similar but different bit of research to tell you about. I'll pass on to you, Mona.
Thank you so much, Jess. Yeah, so like Jess said, we're both passionate about investigating and exploring the past, but we do it in very, very different ways. So in the winter of 1494 to 1495, King Charles VIII of France laid siege to the city of Naples. As soldiers began to return homeward after the siege, so going back to home places across Western Europe, to Spain, to France, across Italy, Germany, even back here to Scotland, contemporaries began to comment on the appearance of a strange and terrifying new sickness. Victims suffered with outbreaks of ulcerations and pustules on their bodies. They had terrible pains in their limbs at night. And in its most horrific form, the disease would rot away the bones and flesh of its living victims. Widely known in Western Europe as the Great Pox, the disease spread very rapidly. It was here in Scotland no later than 1497. By the early 16th century, it had gone global, reaching China and Japan, for example, in the early part of that century. After the initial pandemic wave, the disease settled into human society and became endemic. Indeed, the Great Pox is still with us today, although now we know it as the disease called syphilis, caused by the bacterium Treponema pallidum, subspecies pallidum. However, throughout this presentation, I will continue to use the term Great Pox, and this is because many historians, myself among them, argue that when we talk about diseases in history, it is most appropriate that we use a term for the disease that comes from the historical moment that we're talking about, because this best encapsulates and specifies the particular medical and scientific and cultural thinking around the disease at that particular period in history. So my research focuses on exploring what the Great Pox meant. How was it understood, and how did these understandings impact on society? For instance, how did it impact on families and social networks, and how they viewed and cared or did not care for their sick relatives? And how did it also impact on things like legislation and development of healthcare too? In this presentation, I'm going to focus on one part of this question, and that is the theories around the contagion or the transmission of the disease. So how did it spread through the human population, and how did these theories around its transmission impact or not impact on society in the early modern world? So in order to answer these questions, I've looked to two core sources, and these are what I'm going to explore in this presentation. So those are medical books and government records. But first and foremost, to give a little bit more specificity, my research focuses on the region called the Holy Roman Empire, and particularly on the region that's now modern-day Germany. And within that, I focus very heavily on two cities. These are Frankfurt am Main and Nuremberg. They're relatively large cities in the period that I look at. They're culturally very important, and they're also both quite economically prosperous for much of the period. And the period that I look at, which you'll hear me refer to as the early modern period, covers the years 1495 to 1700. So when I decided that I wanted to investigate the theories of contagion around the Great Pox, the first source that I went to, I think as many of us would with our medical questions, is medical books. So thanks to the advent of printing in Europe in the 15th century, we have an incredibly rich library that we can turn to address these questions. My research has catalogued 152 books from the German-speaking European regions that are entirely dedicated to the French pox, or they have significant sections that are dedicated. Oh, sorry, I said French pox, and that's also a term that's used really commonly in Western Europe at the time. So you might hear me go between French pox and Great Pox a little bit. But these books deal with the medical thinking around the disease. They're written mostly by surgeons and physicians or doctors, and you can see one example. This is the very useful little handbook on the Great Pox by Franz Renner, who is a surgeon in Nuremberg in the 16th century. So looking at the historiography, that is the scholarship that's been written on the Great Pox in the last 30 or so years, many historians have argued that from the very beginning of the European pandemic, Europeans understood the Great Pox as a sexually transmitted disease. And this was something that I expected to see reflected in the medical books. And indeed I did. They talk about how the disease is transmitted through sexual intercourse. However, what I also found, and what was very much not emphasized in the existing historiography until I came along, was that a lot of these medical authors also speak about non-sexual routes of transmission. That is, transmission of the disease through shared drinking vessels, through non-sexual touch, through shared clothing, through money changing hands, through a whole host of different mechanisms. And these theories are deeply fleshed out in the books. They're very much in line with the scientific thinking of the time. They're not kind of off track there. For what was considered scientifically viable in the early modern period, they certainly meet that criteria, and they were certainly important enough for many of these authors to give substantial space in their works to discuss. Moreover, they're also quite important for some of these authors because they help them to justify why they're writing about and treating individuals with this disease. Where the disease was only seen as a sexually transmitted one, it could become very quickly linked in the early modern period to ideas of immorality, and particularly sexual immorality, which is essentially any sex outside of marriage within the paradigm of that period. So by emphasizing that not all individuals were contracting this disease through sexual intercourse, these authors also managed to kind of shore up their own moral position. They weren't necessarily working with groups that society would consider immoral. And this was very important for the surgeons and physicians and their reputations. So this was something that really hadn't been explored at all in scholarship up to now. And I was quite curious to find out, well, is this something that only physicians and surgeons are interested in, or did these theories have a wider impact? Did they mean something for the rest of society as well? So some of the sources that I turned to in order to answer that question were the records of the city councils. So in the early modern period, Frankfurt and Nuremberg were governed autonomously by city councils. They set all of the legislation, they governed day-to-day life, they governed everything in these cities. They meet very frequently, between 2 and 5 times a week, and every single decision that they ever took is recorded in books like the example that you see on the slide. And we're immensely fortunate that these records have survived into the present day. I think they're amazing and very exciting. So looking at these records, I found that indeed the non-sexual theories of transmission had a huge impact on the legislation that these city governments issued to control and deal with the Great Pox. So to take some examples from Nuremberg, in the late 15th century, the city became quite concerned that the disease was actually spreading through pig meat. This was, again, something that was believed around other diseases such as plague at the time too. So all of the pigs in the city had to be inspected. As far as we know, the pigs were not found guilty of spreading any disease in this case. Also, and perhaps a little bit more sinisterly, if that's a word, the city council decided that any poor person with the disease, so again, this is in Nuremberg, any poor person with the disease needed to be moved out of the public sphere. And we also see very similar measures in Frankfurt. So what that meant was the city went on to establish specialist institutions to treat those who became infected with the disease and who couldn't afford their own treatment at home. However, they also began to regulate who could access those institutions. If you were not born in the city, but if you were poor and, for example, a beggar in the city, then the city council instead ruled that you were to be thrown out of the city because you posed a contagion threat to the healthy population. And this was in line with some of the council's broader aims at the time. They were trying to regulate who could access their municipally funded charity. Essentially, they only wanted to spend money on their own citizens, on the poor that they were directly responsible for. So this the threat of contagion was not only something that they had to deal with, but it also became an opportunity for them to regulate the city and to enhance their control. We also see this in the 17th century in Nuremberg. So by this period, Nuremberg is actually in quite a difficult period of its history. It had been through war. The economy was in very, very sharp decline. And in addition to that, the city's government authorities, as well as the religious authorities, were quite worried that because of war and economic decline, the city was going into a vast moral decline as well. And this was seen as a big turn away from the city's previous golden age in the 16th century, where it had this amazing flourishing of art and economy and learning, and indeed religion as well. So the council began to try and legislate to bring the city under much stricter control, both financially to try and revive the economy, and also in an effort to ensure that the city became more moral by their own definitions. And the contagion theories surrounding the Great Pox became one really useful way for them to do that. So in 1632, they issued a piece of legislation stating that any individual who contracted the disease through what they say is sexual immorality, so that's any sex outside of marriage in that period, any individual who contracted the disease in that way was to be thrown out of the city. And that was regardless of whether they were a resident or whether they came from somewhere else. They're absolutely not allowed to access any of the municipal healthcare or any municipal funding for their illness. And we see, so we're very lucky that we also have some letters from individuals or their families who had the disease and applied to the council for help, that this really does have a big impact, because individuals are either very careful to avoid the question of how they contracted the Great Pox, or what we also see is that they emphasize that they contracted it through non-sexual routes. So for example, one soldier writes to say that he contracted it because he slept in a really, really bad environment one night. So I hope in this short talk, I've given you a little insight into why it's so important that we investigate the contagion theories surrounding the Great Pox in the early modern world. Not only did they influence and necessitate certain kinds of legislation from the council, but they also provided a lot of opportunities for the city where they wanted to look after practical matters like their economy, and where they felt that they could also enhance their control over aspects of life like morality as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. So in true Let's Talk About X style, from dissolving dead people to syphilis to helping save the lives of cancer patients, can I welcome up Emily, please?